Coming up, climate change takes center stage and tribal nations are in the spotlight.
Our ancestors have long foretold of a day of reckoning. I believe we are in that day of reckoning. They understood that the world was on a trajectory that just simply wasn't sustainable.
We dive into the debate over a tax ballot measure pitching innovation against alleged sneaky taxes. And get ready to roll the dice on this week's Indigi-Politics. We are dealing out the latest updates on tribal gaming. Next on the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
Support for the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez comes from the Arizona PBS studios in Phoenix at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications at Arizona State University.
Amidawa Hopa. Thank you for joining us. I am Aaliyah Chavez. We start today in the Pacific Northwest, where climate change is on the ballot in Washington state, and the outcome could impact Native nations. Our Mark Trahant was in Washington to see how this law's repeal could impact tribes. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Aaliyah. Washington's climate law that caps emissions and raises funds for projects has been called innovative and a sneaky tax on energy consumers. This fall, voters will get their say. Ballot Measure 2117 would repeal the carbon cap and investment law. I went to Washington last week to take a look.
Our ancestors have long foretold of a day of reckoning. I believe we are in that day of reckoning. They understood that the world was on a trajectory that just simply wasn't sustainable.
The state of Washington and the 29 tribes here have been working for a long time to meet that day of reckoning. This story starts in 2021. Here in Olympia, where legislators look for new ways to raise funds to implement climate programs in communities, including in tribal nations. After several starts and stops, the state passed the 2021 Climate Commitment Act. That law collects fees directly from companies tied to their carbon emissions, some $1.3 billion. This is a new revenue stream for investments ranging from electric heavy trucks and boats to more efficient home heating systems. The fund also pays for a transit pass for every young person in the state.
Our state and a lot of environmental leaders, conservation leaders, and organizations have been working to put a price on carbon almost for a decade now in various forms, initiatives. And I think along the way had learned a lot of lessons around what works, what people are ready for, what's it going to take. And so that meant having an environmental justice at the center. It meant working with tribes.
That environmental justice includes a fund, some $130 million, designated directly for tribal nations. Critics say the law costs too much, especially at the gas pump. Washington has the third highest gas prices in the country.
I think you need to go back to the drawing board and think of policies that will benefit people without destroying opportunities for themselves, their children, and their children's children. And I think that's where we diverge.
Di said it makes more sense to agree on a national climate policy, not one state by state.
I think it's a policy that isn't appropriate for our state. And I think that without the CCA and without the carbon tax on fuels, our society as a whole is moving towards decarbonization, whether some of us like it or not, right? And so to have the CCA is just an expensive, unnecessary layer that we don't need. And I think people can agree with that.
It's worth noting that 24 states have acted to reduce carbon emissions, and 11 of those states have some form of carbon caps. Under Washington's Climate Commitment Act, the state is investing millions of dollars into tribal communities. Climate-related spending ranges from new clean energy projects to the modernization of schools and other buildings. The Nisqually tribe has converted its Elder Center into solar, and is now looking at the prospect of a tribal microgrid. The Nooksack tribe is studying a geothermal energy project. And the Yakima Nation is leveraging the state's funds plus a federal Department of Energy grant that will build a $50 million plus solar and hydro project using open-air irrigation canals. This is a project that adds to the energy grid and boosts the water supply. Indigenous leaders are linking climate initiatives with cultural values. In the Quinault Nation, that means land back.
We gained a $25 million appropriation out of the Washington State Legislature this legislative session from the Climate Commitment Act to acquire the last remaining large 10,000 acres of timber land.
The land is slated to be used for carbon sequestration, basically using the forest land as a sink to reduce the carbon that goes into the atmosphere. But there is an asterisk on the state's appropriation. If Measure 2117 is enacted, funding for these climate-related initiatives will be gone. On the Quinault Nation, tribal citizens take the long view, even though this is a community where the impact of climate change is now. The nation is building a new village on higher ground, away from rising seas and storm surges.
So it'll offer an extra 30 residential lots, and then it will primarily be the relocation of all of our government.
Quinault leaders know the best route forward for managing climate challenges is listening to and working with tribal governments. And a repeal of the state's climate law would mean starting again.
There's an entire world of opportunity where others fail to lead, fail to act, fail to respond to traditional and ancient values that are proven through centuries. As others are collapsing around us, we're rising. And everybody knows at some level, Indigenous people hold such power, resilience, knowledge, and wisdom. But when we're able to do that in a way to lead the rest of the world out of this crisis, that's the opportunity that we see.
If we're going to truly move the paradigm forward and shift our ways of thinking and acting in the face of climate change, it's going to happen best when tribes have the most authority, autonomy, and self-governance over those decisions and affairs.
On the Quinault Nation, Mark Trahant for ICT News. Aaliyah, this story was produced as part of a partnership between ICT and the PBS NewsHour to cover how climate change is impacting Indigenous communities.
Mark, thank you so much for that reporting.
Visiting with family and relatives will help us from feeling lonely or socially isolated. COVID-19 changed everything, like our ancestors who survived war, famine, and epidemics. Our elders had to make sacrifices too. The more we are socially connected with our family and community, the less health problems we will have and the longer we will live. We need to stay active to keep our spirits alive. Remember, you are not alone. Connected together, we will stand strong. For more information on elder isolation or caregiver resources, go to connectedindigenousElders.org.
On this week's Indigi-Politics, we talk about the latest with tribal gaming. Regular contributor John Tahsuda is at this year's Indian Gaming Convention and Trade Show. He'll talk about this with ICT political correspondent Pauly Denetclaw, and John is a principal with Navigators Global.
Welcome back to the newscast, John.
Thanks for having me. It's a good time to be in sunny South California.
So before we get into our conversation, I really wanted folks at home to learn a little bit more about the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. And so I was wondering if you could give us the history and what rights this act gives to tribes.
Certainly. So again, and in some ways, really appropriate that we're here in Southern California because the Supreme Court case that confirmed the tribal authority to do this came out of Southern California. The Cabazon Band of Mission Indians was the sort of lead tribe in the case, but there were there were a number of others, including Morongo, Borona, and other tribes that were sort of in litigation with the state at the same time. But it sort of moved, previously had been in Florida as sort of the locus of litigation, and had moved to Southern California. And that was the case that ultimately went up to the Supreme Court. And there the court said that in this case, bingo, which is what the primary gaming offering at the time was by the tribes, high stakes bingo, was something that the tribes could offer without state regulation, without the influence of the state. And it was an interesting case because they really just followed prior precedent that dealt with this law called Public Law 280, which had been passed during the termination period, and it gave the states criminal jurisdiction over tribes. But the Supreme Court later on had said it didn't give the states civil regulatory jurisdiction over the tribes. And so in some ways, Cabazon really just confirmed that prior precedent. But because of the excitement around gaming activities, even high stakes bingo, which we think of as pretty tame these days, but that was still, something that the state was really invested in trying to prevent. And so it was a big victory for the tribes, and really led to a year later, which is lightning speed in terms of congressional action. So it tells you how much people were interested in this at the time. A year later, in 1988, they passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which in many ways just took the rationale that the court had laid out and implemented that into statutory law. And so, and the one effect of that was because there was open questions after the Supreme Court case, since it had happened in a PL 280 state, what would be the status of the law in states that weren't governed by PL 280 and the tribes that are there, et cetera. And so the statute just sort of leveled the playing field for all the tribes and all the states to sort of establish a national standard for what the authorities were and how tribes could offer gaming.
And John, I just learned this last year, but the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act actually defines what tribes can use their gaming profits for. So can you tell us a little bit about how tribes can utilize their gaming profits?
Certainly. One of the things that the statute did that sort of went a step beyond what the Supreme Court had talked about was the use of the revenue funds from gaming. And in part of the analysis that the tribes put forward was that this revenue was vitally important to the operation of their tribal governments. And that was part of the tribal interest that the Supreme Court thought was really, really important and sort of weighed heavily in their favor in that Cabazon case. And so the Congress kind of pulled that into the statute, again, going beyond what the Supreme Court had said. But in doing that, they really said, in essence, that these funds, this revenue funds from tribal gaming, should really be focused on tribal governments. And so there are sort of 5 broad categories that the money can be used for. But primarily, they're looking at supporting tribal governments and letting tribal governments help support other local governments in case, the impacts of tribal gaming impact, law enforcement, emergency services, those kind of things. So that was the intent of it. One thing that people focus on a lot is revenue sharing with the states. And that is something that really wasn't part of that original drafting, and still is not, but it has been incorporated into how these Class 3 compacts are negotiated. So, you can look at it as a way that the states are siphoning off tribal funds, which seems not consistent with the intents of IGRA. But at the same time, it does sort of go along this same sort of vein of it's supporting government operations, the tribal government, and then their interactions with the state. And so those are sort of the focus that really people need to do. When you look at the tribal government, there's really broad uses they can do it for: healthcare, roads, almost anything, as long as it goes through the tribal government.
And you're at the Indian Gaming Association convention and trade show right now. Can you tell us a little bit if you've heard of anything that is noteworthy, issues that are happening, cases that are happening with tribal gaming?
Certainly. So I would just note that 25 years ago, I started working with the National Indian Gaming, what was then called the National Indian Gaming Association. And we were celebrating then what we thought were huge increases in the industry, from 15 million to 15 billion to 16 billion, and in a few years it passed 20. It's now past 20 billion. So in 25 years, it has doubled in size. And that's really, amazing in the sense you think this is not doubling in size from 100 million to 200 million, but 20 billion to 40 billion. I mean, that's a major industry by any standards in our country. So that's a testament to the tribes' acumen, their success, and their ability to build relationships with the local communities. Many of the tribal operations are very dependent upon having great relationships with local governments, which is a huge turnaround, as those of us know from tribal history. Oftentimes, historically, they fought with the local governments, but now they've become much more cooperative. And that's been one of the great side benefits, I think, of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act.
And are there any legal cases that tribal leaders or those interested in following Indian gaming should keep their eye on?
Well, there's been for several years now running litigation coming out of Florida dealing with sports wagering and really, but getting more to the essence of mobile gaming. We used to call it online, but now since everything's on a phone, we call it mobile gaming. And so there's a lot of focus on that. And it's partly driven by just the industry itself. As an industry matures, right, you look for new ways to operate, new ways to make revenue. And as mobile sort of lifestyles have become a big part of American culture, tribes, and not just tribes, but, the commercial gaming industry has looked to try to be a part of that. But then that runs sort of headlong into IGRA, which is, a 1988 piece of legislation. There was no internet in 1988, much less mobile, gaming, et cetera. So the principles that are outlined in IGRA are really focused on sort of on the ground operations. And when you move it to mobile devices, there's a lot of questions there. So this litigation in Florida is really focused around that. And again, the tribe, the Seminole tribe in Florida, has a great relationship with the state and their local governments. And so they had worked out this deal, but of course, commercial interests, that want to be part of that, money-making endeavor, have sued over that. So it's really sort of a private litigation versus government action. And in this point, it's a joint action by the tribe and the state. So that's really been a lot of focus. People are anxiously looking to see where that ends up, so that they can sort of further plan out how they want to proceed. So that's probably the largest litigation piece. There has been, last year, there was a big effort in California to do a referendum around daily sports wagering and sort of the mobile aspects of that. And the tribes were not happy that the people that were pushing that referendum had included them in the talks, because the tribes are trying to proceed very carefully, in light of their legal situation, as well as how they can best sort of partner with their local communities and their patrons, et cetera. So they were not happy with that, and they actually opposed it, and it went down, really went down in flames in a big way. And so one of the big discussions here in INAHAM at IGA this year is about that, and how can, so these are big market players that brought this, try to bring this referendum forward. And so they are interested in talking to the tribes now. They realize they can't proceed without them. And so that's a big topic of conversation here now. And in some ways, just like the litigation, I think people are watching how that relationship develops to see what the paths forward may be in the next few years.
Well, John, that's all the time that we have. Once again, thank you so much for joining the newscast.
Thanks. Always fun.
Growing up, I've always wanted to help people. I remember stories of my mom telling me, walking down the aisle at the grocery store and just asking people, how are you doing today? As a nurse, we're taught to lay hands, and that's so much healing. A lot of people don't get that loving touch. And as a nurse, going back to the reservation, I think, man, like, how much impact can you make just loving people right? I think for a long time, the Native American people have been fed this lie of you're dependent upon, say, the government. But I would love to create a culture where it's the Native American that says, I'm doing this so that I can make my community better. I'm doing this so that I could bring commerce into my community. I'm doing this so that I can have the resources to help others.
Arabe tuat tavai, which is Ute for today is a good day. Arabe is today, tuat is good, and tavai is day. Arabe tuat tavai, which is Ute for today is a good day.
Fawn Sharp has served as president of the National Congress of American Indians and president of the Quinault Indian Nation, while also working to forge solutions to the climate change crisis. She sat down with ICT's Mark Trahant and says that she'll be stepping back from tribal leadership to devote more time to her climate and other work.
Fawn Sharp, thank you for joining us on the newscast.
Yes, thank you.
I want to talk to you about the arc of your career.
Yes, that arc definitely began before I could even remember. I grew up here on the Quinault Reservation. My grandparents fished for a living. I knew as an 8-year-old what treaty abrogation meant. That inspired me to want to become an attorney to defend our treaty rights. No one in my family had ever gone to college at that point, and so early in those years, my mother worked as a recording secretary for the Northwest Indian Fish Commission, and so it was my job to hit the play and the record button, and I traveled throughout the Pacific Northwest listening to our tribal leaders talk about what was at stake in the Bolt decision.
The 1974 case that affirmed treaty rights for fishing and hunting and helped steer you to a legal career.
I mentioned my grandfather. He told me years ago that a law degree is a social tool, it's a political tool, and it's an economic tool. And I feel like I've spent an entire career, multiple careers, advancing those basic principles. And I've lived decades of public service. And so looking at the last prong of economic advancements, that's a tool I've been gifted, and so I do see that an emerging role for us to not only advance tribal interests and tribal sovereignty in a political sense, but we have an entire world of opportunity, a global economy, resources and access that we now have that we historically just didn't have. What that means for me is I'm at a place in time where I've prepared my entire lifetime for the next chapter of my life. And what that means for me at this point is I'm not going to be seeking re-election here at the Quinault Nation. I've run 6 terms prior to becoming an elected official. I served over a decade as the reservation attorney in the Attorney General's office here at Quinault. Elders told me, Fawn, if you want to come back to serve the nation, it's going to be so important for you to go outside to gain experience. And so I worked at a federal level, I worked at a state level. I saw the inner workings of government at the highest levels. I brought that knowledge back and I applied it as an elected official. And I can honestly say for 6 terms, 18 years, I served every bit to the very best of my abilities, upholding and honoring an oath of office that I took so dearly. And now I get to take all of that knowledge, all of that experience and wisdom and apply it in a way where I know we have to go. I know we have to be a global player politically, economically, socially. And so that's where I'm at right now.
And part of that might mean working with other tribes.
Yes, absolutely. Working with other tribes, I think there are a number of tribes that are actively working to capture carbon. They're actively working on efforts to do the things that we know is necessary. There's trillions of metric tons of carbon in the atmosphere. We have to capture and store some of that. We have to look at orphan methane gas leaks all across just Oklahoma, for example. There's thousands of methane leaks. And so scientists are saying we're not going to get to target just by reducing emissions. We actually have to capture and store those emissions. So as we work internally to do things like we are here at Quinault, restoring our salmon, moving our villages to higher ground, there's an entire globe that's in crisis, that's in physical crisis, and we have to do all we can to take out carbon, to capture and store methane fuels, because it is a ticking time bomb. And so other tribes are doing that, and I'm just excited to take the knowledge and wisdom that I've gained over the years and apply it in a way that creates an explosion of economic growth across Indian country. And I know when you look at things like tribal gaming and the ability that tribes have been able to advance, being leading employers in their county and in their states, an economic force, the scale of the growth that's in front of us is like tribal gaming on steroids. And it's an opportunity for us to have influence domestically here inside the United States, but also globally. And it energizes me, it inspires me. And so when I do go to other parts of the world and I see others so desperate for solutions, and I have a conversation with somebody from Dow Industries of Europe, for example, and talking about ecosystems. You don't have to recreate those in a lab. You could come out to Quinault and see from glacier to ocean a river system in which there's no there's no development. And so I'm after taking our message globally, but just as important, inviting CEOs, investors out to Indian country, because when you do business with us, it's a much different process.
Fawn Sharp, thank you very much.
Thank you. Siau Kuiau.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.